Charles Arthur Pretty Boy Floyd. A criminal portrayed by police and media as America's #1 bank-robbing, kidnapping, murdering gangster. Yet Charlie wasn't exactly what others painted him out to be. A bank robber indeed, but his style and crimes were quite the opposite of his reputation. He modeled himself after the old-style American desperados of the Wild West. The Daltons, the Youngers, Jesse James. He was the last of that breed. The last of the great American bank robbers. Charles Floyd was hated by the police, yet loved by the people. He became a romanticized hero, the Robin Hood of his day, taking from the rich and giving to the poor. While much of his heroism has been greatly exaggerated, there was an element of truth.
I'm the son of Charles Arthur Floyd, and I guess I'm the only person I've ever heard of went to school under an assumed name. And I knew that he robbed banks and things, but he was a good father to me, and he treated my mother well, and we had a lot of fun together.
My uncle was not a screwball. He took the money. He didn't shoot anybody in the bank, like Bonnie and Clyde, and take $20 and leave somebody dead. Even though he robbed banks, he had morals and he had scruples, if you can say that about a bank robber.
Charles Arthur Floyd became the epitome of the social bandit, a voice of the disenfranchised and the downtrodden. But to the Justice Department, he was just another gunslinging gangster.
Charlie Floyd was no gangster. He was a country boy turned bandit. But instead of a cow pony and a Colt 45, he chose a Thompson submachine gun, a sedan, to liberate money from those banks during the Great Depression. I'll make no excuses for Charlie Floyd. He was a criminal, pure and simple. He did bad things, but he didn't do as many bad things as everybody thinks. Actually, I guess what he was a country boy who just didn't want to pick cotton.
Born in the mountains of northwestern Georgia, Charlie was the fourth of Walter and Mamie Floyd's 7 children. Hard-working, honest, God-fearing farmers who shortly after Charlie's birth made a big move to eastern Oklahoma in search of a better life.
They moved in to the little town of Aikens, Oklahoma. That old town used to be called Sweet Town because they made a lot of good molasses there, and they had cotton gins, and there was some prosperity and hope, and that's really where Charlie Floyd came of age.
For years, cotton had led the farming industry throughout Oklahoma. Though it brought food to the table, it also brought bleeding fingers with everlasting calluses from picking it. Hard work that young Charlie soon realized wasn't for him.
Charlie Floyd was in many ways typical of the farm boys in the hills of eastern Oklahoma. Charlie worked hard ever since he was a boy. 12 hours in the fields was common, sometimes far longer hours during the harvest season.
Growing bored and restless with the monotony of picking cotton, Charlie at age 10 committed his first documented crime, stealing cookies from a local store.
Those little cookies were kind of just the beginning. Certainly Mamie and Walter Floyd tried their best to keep these kids on the straight and narrow path. And Walter did it in his own way, usually with his hand or a belt, and Mamie did it with her loving ways and a little bit of the Bible.
But a little bit of the Bible wasn't enough for young Charlie. There was a lot of the devil in him and his friends.
Charlie, as a youngster, growing up, was jovial and a prankster and ornery. Of course, most boys are when they're growing up, but everybody seemed to think quite a bit of him.
No time or place was ever too sacred for Charlie and his pals to pull their pranks.
Everybody was Baptist and Yellow Dog Democrats down there, but they took those boys to those brush arbor revivals where they got big, ample doses of the Old Testament, and and the fear of the Lord. And they sang hymns till they lost their voices, and they were there all night long under those brush arbors.
It was typical in those times for women attending these meetings to take their infants and wrap them in quilts and bed them down as evening approached in the straw in the back of their family farm wagons. Well, Charlie and his boys slipped out of this revival meeting and very stealthily and quietly moved those babies from one wagon to the next, until all the babies thoroughly switched.
In those wee hours when those families were going home and those mamas started messing with those sleeping babies, we would have heard a sort of a simultaneous scream come out of those parts as all these people figured out that they had the wrong child. And it took far into the next day for people to get those babies switched back. That was the kind of devilment Floyd and his friends would pull down there.
But Charlie didn't stop with practical jokes. It wasn't long before he crossed the line between boyhood pranks and criminal activity.
The first real serious crime, if you don't count switching babies and stealing cookies, a serious crime Charlie Floyd committed when he was about 17, 18 years old. It was in May of 1922, down in Aikens, down in his hometown. And he and some others allegedly broke into a little country post office. And they made off with pennies. Not just a few pennies, but $350 worth of pennies that they had in there, I guess, for odd change.
It's his first felony. This was federal territory, the post office. The federal authorities were called down from Muskogee to investigate. Well, at this point, Charlie probably thought the heat was on, and they dumped the coins into a well on his grandfather's farm. Federal authorities came around figuring Charlie must be involved in this some way, in some manner. And his father said, no, my boy was home asleep at that time. Well, his father may have made a mistake covering for his son, because this was the beginning, in a small way, of his criminal career.
But even at the time, no one could have guessed this handsome young man would one day have a price on his head. By Charlie's late teens, he had had enough of this back-breaking labor and decided to take advantage of Oklahoma's dry state status.
Moonshining was very big in those hills in eastern Oklahoma, and Charlie soon was bootlegging whiskey for the local moonshiners, making a little pocket change here and there.
There were a lot of moonshiners going on during those days. Liquor was prohibited in Oklahoma, and so you had to take it upon yourself to create your libation, to cook your own whiskey out in the woods. And everybody had a bootlegger. The banker had a bootlegger. Sometimes the preacher had a bootlegger. Charlie Floyd certainly knew how to make moonshine and knew how to drink good moonshine.
Charlie was clearly heading down a crooked path when he momentarily became sidetracked. His diversion was Ruby Hargraves, a tall, thin, pretty young woman who found this square-jawed, handsome, well-built young man equally attractive. It wasn't long before they were both deeply in love.
They had a great passion, and you'd see them together down there in those country places, on those paths through the berry bushes and out by the graveyard, and they did some heavy-duty courting. And out of that passion came a son, and of course they married and had a very simple, straightforward marriage.
A few hours after I was born, my father came to the bed and got me and took me to a mirror, and he held me up side of him, you know, and he said, look, he's going to be a fighter. We're going to name him Jack Dempsey. Jack Dempsey was the heavyweight champion of the world. My mother said, no, we're not. We're going to name him Charles Dempsey.
These happy days for the Floyds quickly became overshadowed by poor economic times. Farmers were the first to feel the oncoming Great Depression, and by 1925, farm prices were plummeting. As families lost their crops, banks foreclosed on their farms. Retaliation by social bandits, as they were called, sprung up everywhere, And before long, Charlie Floyd saw a new opportunity to make ends meet.
He was apparently trying to make an honest living as well as he could. He had Ruby, his pretty young wife, his little baby boy, but still he had those itchy feet. Charlie's big waltz on that line separating good for evil really took a turn for the worse, if you will, back in 1925. That's when he went big time.
Charlie grabbed some friends and a gun, then robbed nearly $12,000 of payroll money en route from a St. Louis bank to the Kroger grocery company.
Charlie and one of his pals made the mistake of coming right back home. He always went back home to those beloved hills of Oklahoma. Went back to Salisaw smoking a big cigar, driving a car, and sporting some clothes, and they smelled the bay rum. They looked good.
Local police there saw Charlie Floyd coming into town, and they knew he must have been up to no good. They stopped him and frisked him and his partner and found rolls of bills on him, still with the wrappers from the Tower Grove Bank. Well, it wasn't long before Charlie was being shipped back to St. Louis. And in fact, his partner soon spilled the beans, and Charlie could do nothing but plead guilty.
He left behind a crying wife and a crying baby boy. And he didn't see him again for a long time. Because after that gavel went down in that St. Louis courtroom, they carried him off to the middle of the state, up on the bluffs of the Missouri River, in a big old dank stone penitentiary, the Missouri State Penitentiary. And that's where Charlie did his time, and he did it hard.
Charlie ended up serving 3.5 years of a 5-year sentence. His time in Jefferson City, Missouri was probably the worst 3.5 years of Charlie's life.
There was correspondence for a time with Ruby on the outside, but that prison time spent up in Jeff City took a toll, and by the time he got out, she had divorced him. Ruby divorced Charlie Floyd and went off and took off with a man who was good to her and good to her boy.
Jefferson City was a hellhole. I mean, just regular beatings and just one thing after another, and if you couldn't supply some money to some of the guards and so forth, you know, you would get you know what, details, and which was terrible. I'm sure it was a bad experience because he said he would never go back. He would never be taken alive again, and he never did.
But Charlie made use of his time in prison. He observed and learned a lot, all from the wrong people.
He spent all of his spare time discussing crime and robberies with some of the hardened cons and veteran criminals who were there in the prison. This was his education. In other words, in many ways, he failed prison. Because by the time he was done, he was determined to renew his career on the outlaw trail, and this time to do it right.
Kansas City, a town ripe with corruption, crime, and loose morals. Also one of Charlie's first stops as a free man. It was here he earned his famous name, Pretty Boy.
The story goes that Floyd got his nickname one night while he was playing cards in Ash's boarding house. Beulah Baird, who was a really beautiful young woman, tall, buxom, quite a looker, sidled up to him, put a beer down in front of him, and said, "What's your name, pretty boy?" The name stuck, and Beulah stuck to Floyd.
Charlie and his new girlfriend appeared to live well despite economic downfall. It wasn't long before family members caught wind that something wasn't right.
I remember one time he had this real fancy automobile when I was just a young kid. Well, I thought that was really something. And that's when I guess, really realized that Charlie was making some money, probably illegally. Well, by that time, he'd robbed Earl for a bank, the Maud Bank, and Tupelo Bank. He robbed banks for a living. He couldn't go back.
During that very busy year of 1930, mostly spent up in Ohio, finally Charlie was pinched by the authorities. This time for his high crimes and misdemeanors, they gave him 12 to 15 years to do in the big house. Under guard and put on a train, and was headed to that penitentiary. But in the darkness of night, on a speeding train, he kicked out the window, eluded his guards, and vaulted off into time and space, into that void, into that darkness, into the brush, into the Ohio countryside. Pretty boy escaped.
The press now caught on to the catchy name Pretty Boy. Newspapers became flooded with stories of Charles Pretty Boy Floyd.
He rises to prominence, he rises to fame against the backdrop of the most incredible economic downturn the nation has ever known, which hit the very region out of which he came the hardest of any part of America, which then, of course, was attacked by nature as well. It seemed as if everything, nature and man, was conspiring against these people. They looked for heroes wherever they could find them. And here's a local boy making good, robbing the enemy, robbing the banks, robbing those who prey upon them the most. No wonder they worship Charlie Floyd.
Though Charlie was a hero to many, he wasn't happy. He missed Ruby and his son Dempsey. Charlie tracked them down, and this once happy family instantly became reunited.
My mother and father, when I saw them together, they were, it was just great. They were in love. You could tell they were. And I used to go in before they get up. You know, kids usually get up before their parents. And I'd go ahead and look at them, and excuse me, he'd always have his arm kind of around her. And it thrilled me to see them that way.
They took up residence in Fort Smith, Arkansas, out in a quiet little neighborhood, living under the alias of Jack Hamilton, Mr. and Mrs. Jack Hamilton and son in Fort Smith, Arkansas. And he took on the disguise of a traveling salesman, a peddler, with his valises and bags and his old car driving around.
It was the best 6 months of my life that I can remember being with him. He did a lot of funny things. He teased my mother, and he cooked for us. He made spaghetti and meatballs, and he enjoyed cooking and doing things with us. Took me fishing and did everything that fathers usually do, wrestle around with me. And at night, he'd always take me to bed. He'd put me on his shoulders and take me in and throw me into bed, you know, like having fun with me.
Later on, when he moved over to Tulsa, he wasn't really a traveling salesman at all. Fact is, he was out robbing banks. He was doing what he knew how to do best. And that's liberate hard cash and currency from the bankers who many folks insisted were on the wrong side of the law themselves.
Charlie always made sure his son had plenty of money and gave him many of the coins he obtained from banks.
He said, I'll tell you something. He said, there's a sack of coins underneath my bed. Anytime you want something, just come in and get your handful of money and go do it. So that was great. I had a lot of friends, you know, we'd always have money for ice cream, or we'd go to the show and stuff. And my mother discovered it, and she counted it all out and went down and bought me a suit with short pants, which was really a bad thing. You know, sissies only wore short pants, but that was the end of the money.
It was also the end of these sweet times, as Tulsa police began to close in on Charlie's whereabouts.
The police went over there, rumbling down the street in an armored truck with all kinds of weapons brandished and so forth. And of course, much to their chagrin, the phantom terror, old Charlie Floyd, Pretty Boy, and his partner slipped out the back door. He disappeared. The bed sheets hanging on the line and were gone and away. So the police were left empty-handed, foiled again, embarrassed. But that wouldn't be the first nor the last time that Charlie made his escape. He was pretty good at it.
By 1930, Charles Pretty Boy Floyd was a household name. He was accused of committing every crime across America, from bank robberies to murders. Charlie Floyd now had a price on his head.
Nobody knows for sure how many banks Charlie Floyd robbed in his lifetime. He robbed many, maybe 40, 50, 60, maybe more, maybe less. Mostly country banks. They didn't have a lot of money in them.
Throughout American history, once a particular outlaw got a grand reputation, Jesse James, for example, Billy the Kid, in this case, Charlie Floyd, then everybody who suffered a robbery, every bank that was robbed or held up, wanted to attribute that to none other than the #1 outlaw of the day. Dozens and dozens of bank holdups were attributed to Pretty Boy Floyd himself. Nobody wanted to admit they'd been robbed by some nondescript criminal.
While no one could prove that Charlie committed many of these crimes, there was one incident that would forever label him as a killer.
We know for sure that on April the 9th, 1932, Charlie Floyd killed a man, killed him dead. A good man named Irv Kelly, former lawman turned bounty hunter, and he and some others set up an ambush for Charlie out at the Hardgraves Farm in Bixby, Oklahoma, outside of Tulsa.
Charlie arrived at the farm in the wee hours of the morning for what he thought was a secret rendezvous with his wife Ruby and son Dempsey.
We don't really know what happened, but Irv Kelly leveled a submachine gun at Charlie Floyd. Charlie Floyd immediately opened up with his .45, and Irv Kelly let loose with his submachine gun. 4 of 5 bullets that Charlie Floyd fired found their mark, and Irv Kelly fell dead. Before he did, though, 4 rounds that he'd fired from that submachine gun struck Charlie Floyd.
Painful as they were, Charlie's wounds weren't life-threatening. Though Charlie recovered, he never forgot his killing of Irv Kelly.
And I think it bothered him. He talked about it. He talked about it in some of the few interviews he gave to newspaper reporters. And he discussed it because he knew he left behind kids, but he said it was the old stories, either killed or be killed, and he felt like he had to do it. That's the only for sure killing I know Charlie Floyd did.
Right or wrong, many people dismissed Charlie's killing of Irv Kelly as justified self-defense. They felt that if anything, Charlie helped more people than he robbed or killed.
He gave money to people, not only kinfolk, but to other people as well. We tracked down an incident where he actually brought money, groceries, to families that weren't going to have a Christmas. They just didn't have anything at all. Depression was on, times were tough. It's not to justify Charlie Floyd. He was a bank robber, and he did kill people, but there were some good sides to him too, and on some of those days out in the Oklahoma countryside.
I've heard that he did tear some deeds up of people's farms that the bank had, and I know of people that he helped with money. And anybody, well, one thing, if you're on the run and you got people you have to have people hiding you, you have to be very generous with them, or somebody might turn you in. And I think that's one of the reasons he got that Robin Hood thing, because he was very generous with everybody that helped him.
An old-timer said that the car drove up, and Charlie got out. He said, I'm kind of hungry. Any chance of sharing a meal? He said, I have barely enough to feed my family. He said, if I had enough, you know, you're more than welcome. Charlie said, I understand. Shook hands with him, walked off, and he looked down, he had a $20 bill in his hand.
In Charlie's beloved Oklahoma hills, he was a hero. To the working-class farmer, Charlie couldn't have been more honest.
But one time, he drove up in front of our house, and I went out and talked to him a minute. He said he just run over one of Miss Smith's hens down there. chickens out in the dirt road. He run over one of them hens and killed it. He stopped and paid her for it, and he had the hen in the car. Take it home and cook it, I guess.
The people's love for Charlie was most evident when he robbed his hometown bank.
The most memorable bank job of all was when he drove right down into the heart of Salisaw. Parked, got out. Charlie walked into the barber shop, knew everybody there getting shaves and trims, shook hands all around. They said, "What are you doing in town?" He said, "Well, I'm here to rob the bank. Give 'em hell." That's what he gave him.
Word spread quickly. Much of the town showed up to witness this grand event, including many of Charlie's family.
My father told his grandfather, "I'm going to rob the bank today, Grandpa, and I want you to stay over there by the train station, and you can watch and see what happens." So he robbed the bank, and they got away without any incident or out getting shot or anything. So the next time he saw his grandfather, he said, "Grandpa, did you see me rob the bank?" He said, "No." He said, "I got sleepy and went to sleep and missed the whole thing."
But things turned for Charlie. After months of successful holdups, he and his new bank robbing partner, Adam Ricchetti, stumbled into the wrong city at the wrong time. Kansas City was about to experience one of the most famous crimes in its history.
The cavernous Union Station in Kansas City, standing there to this day like an empty old veteran on that fine, warm June morning in 1933, was the scene of this crime when a captive Frank Jelly Nash, who was a very well-known gangster of the day, had been taken prisoner and was being transported under escort back to Leavenworth in Kansas.
He's being taken out of the station to be placed in a car, surrounded by federal and local officers. Suddenly, 3 men with submachine guns burst onto the scene and began raking the automobile and the officers with submachine gun fire. It was a bloody confrontation in broad daylight on a Saturday morning. Nash himself was killed.
He died in either an ambush to shut him up or to free him, and so did several lawmen. They died as well. And this was big news across the country. I mean, big headlines.
J. Edgar Hoover and the Bureau of Investigation, soon to be called the FBI, were outraged. One of their men was down. They blamed Charles Floyd for the shooting. But Floyd wasn't there. He wasn't even close. The massacre was, in fact, a hit organized by local organized criminals who were in concert with the politicians in the community, for Kansas City was incredibly corrupt in those days. But it was easier for Hoover to blame the notorious Floyd than it was to go after the politicians and the gangsters who really ran everything in Kansas City.
Mr. Hoover, probably the most ambitious man of this century in this country. And his rush to judgment, rush to justice, he wanted to solve this crime, and this crime was very important to him because with the death of these officers, he was able to win new considerations and enhance his position and enhance his own bureau.
My father wasn't a hired killer. He robbed banks, and he got all the money he needed from robbing banks. Why would he take a fee for killing some policemen that were trying to transfer another criminal? You know, I don't think he ever had anything to do with Nash. I never heard Nash's name mentioned in my life, except with the Kansas City massacre.
But J. Edgar Hoover's mind was made up. Charles Arthur Pretty Boy Floyd was now United States public enemy #1.
No time, money, or labor will be spared toward bringing about the apprehension of the individuals responsible for this cowardly and despicable act. They must be exterminated. And to this end, we are dedicating ourselves. J. Edgar Hoover, 1933.
The rise of Charlie Floyd and the rise of J. Edgar Hoover came together. Floyd had a couple of 45s, he had a Thompson submachine gun, he had a fast car. But he had little else, except a big reputation, one built constantly by the newspapers, the popular press, the pulp magazines. By making Floyd into public enemy number one, Hoover made himself and his organization important by bringing him down. J. Edgar Hoover owed a lot to Charlie Floyd.
With their wanted posters plastered coast to coast, Charlie and his partner, Adam Ricchetti, were running for their lives. By now, Charlie had reunited with his girlfriend, Beulah, along with her sister, Rose, who took a liking to Adam.
Charlie and Adam Ricchetti and the girls, Beulah and Rose, now left for parts unknown. Eventually, they arrived in Buffalo, New York, there to spend almost a year hiding. Once in Buffalo, they spent most of their time in an upstairs apartment, getting cabin fever after not too many months.
After 1 year of isolation, the foursome couldn't take it any longer. They decided to come home to Charlie's beloved Oklahoma hills.
Sometime during the night of October 19th and 20th, 1934, they were passing between East Liverpool and Wellsville, Ohio, which are two little river towns right on the Ohio River, about 4 or 5 miles apart, and they had an accident. Charlie and Adam Ricchetti decided that they would wait on a hillside just outside of Wellsville, Ohio, and they sent the women with the car, which was apparently still drivable, into East Liverpool to get repairs made.
Adam and Charlie grabbed a couple blankets and their weapons and went up on the hillside there to wait for them. And they stuck out as strangers. And some of the locals there spotted them. And by and by, the local policeman came out to check it out. A little bit of a gun scrape ensued. Adam was taken prisoner. There were a lot of shots fired. But the Phantom Terror managed to escape.
With local police now aware who Adam Ricchetti was, federal officers were called in. The hunt was on for Pretty Boy Floyd.
Floyd roamed the woods of Columbiana County for 48 hours. Finally, on the afternoon of October 22nd, he came out of the woods about 15 or 16 miles from the spot where he had jumped out of the car and approached the home of a widow named Ellen Conkle and asked her for a meal.
He explained to her that he had been out squirrel hunting, where she knew he wasn't any squirrel hunter, out in that dirty blue suit and a necktie, and she fed him anyway. People didn't turn people away from the door back then.
Why she didn't suspect that this was the guy on the front page of the newspaper, I have no idea. But in October 1934, the last thing on anybody's mind in this part of the Ohio Valley was, the sudden appearance of public enemy number one. She prepared him a fairly respectable meal. He ate the meal, was very pleased with it, termed it as fit for a king, and gave her $1 for it when he concluded, which is about 4 or 5 times what a meal like that would have cost back then.
He looked about, he saw that there was a car outside, asked whose it was, and if he couldn't get a ride. The car belonged to Mrs. Conkle's brother, Stuart Dyke, who agreed to drive Floyd. But as they were pulling out of the farm, their exit was blocked by the law.
Melvin Purvis, Hoover's right-hand man, and local law enforcement agents, including a World War I sharpshooter, Chester Smith, were going from farm to farm, searching for Charlie. They found their man.
Floyd immediately leapt from the car, but there was nowhere to go, just open fields, and he began to sprint across an open cornfield. Only the stubs of the stalks stood up. He was completely exposed.
I raised my .32-20 Winchester rifle. I didn't want to kill him, so I hit him in the right forearm. I shot the second time and hit him in the right shoulder.
And here's where you get the two versions of the story. You get the Ohio version, you get the FBI. The FBI says they talked to him and Purvis interrogated him and he spat at him and cursed him and he died. But the Ohio people, the truth as Chester Smith told it, that finally when he got what he wanted out of Floyd, that's when Purvis said, do him in, and they killed him. They shot him point blank in that field. And that young man died 30 years old forever, right there on that spot.
The reason why there's a confliction in Purvis' story and mine, he said that this information was not to be revealed to the public, and they wanted to make it announced that I had killed him.
When I was in school, they'd say, there goes Chester Smith's daughter. He killed pretty boy Floyd, you know, and they'd say, is that true? And I'd say, well, no, he shot him. If my father had wanted to kill the man, it would have been easy to kill him. He could hit him in a very vital spot, seeing that he was a sharpshooter. He did not intend to kill. He intended to bring him down.
Melvin Purvis ordered put into his back when he was laying there in the cornfield, and that's execution. Although he was a killer and he was a bank robber, that day he didn't fire a shot on Mrs. Conkle's farm. Nobody was shot on Mrs. Conkle's farm but my uncle, Charlie.
I walked the last 100 yards that Charlie walked, and he could have been a world-class sprinter, and he could have made it to the top. But he wasn't going back to jail. He wasn't going to be caged up like a lion the rest of his life. And he paid for it.
Regardless of how Charlie died, he was just as popular dead as he was alive.
At the funeral home, it was kind of a mild form of complete chaos. And they brought the body there and put it on the table. And while it was on the table, everybody that had any connection with the East Liverpool Police Department managed to get their picture taken with the body. They're fingerprinting the corpse, and everybody wanted to see public enemy number one. Crowds that are variously estimated at anywhere from 10,000 to 20,000 people just absolutely descended on the Sturgis funeral home. And eventually Floyd was displayed for the public on a little, like a day bed, with a crushed velvet cover up to his neck.
When Charlie's body was finally shipped back home, his funeral was an event. To this day, it is the largest funeral in Oklahoma's history.
I was 14 years old when this was happening, and it was awesome. And it was just a solid line of cars, bumper to bumper, dust and dirt blowing and whatever. People crowding in, it was pathetic the way people would act and trying to get in the front row seat.
Some say as many as 40,000, maybe even more people showed up. Every flower shop in Fort Smith and Muskogee and all throughout that part of the country was wiped out. They bought every bloom and blade and sent it to Akins. They sent it over to Pretty Boy, to Charlie.
While the public clamored for one last glimpse of Charlie Floyd, his family somberly reflected on their memories of him alive.
He come to our house one night, and the door opened. There was a mirror hanging on the wall right there. And I could see him in that mirror. He was smiling, you know. He always had a nice smile. And that's the last
time that I ever saw my uncle. I was coming down the old dirt road, and I was probably about 8 years old. And got up close to him, and I was looking at him, and he was grinning. And got up close, and where I could see, here he was with his old straw hat and a pair of overalls and a silk undershirt. Had an uncle.
One year to the day he died, Beulah and Rose and Adam, who was festering away in jail, bought some space in a Kansas City paper and composed a poem. And it was published in that paper. And it was a tribute, their tribute, to the memory of their friend, Charlie Floyd.
We never knew what pain he had. We did not see him die.
We only knew he passed away and did not say goodbye.
We're thinking of you, Daddy dear, thinking of the past.
You left behind some broken hearts that loved you to the last.
That never did, nor never will forget you, Daddy dear.
And while you rest in peaceful sleep,
your memory we shall always keep.
Americans love bandits. We always have. We probably always will. People like Charlie Floyd are especially endearing to us because they're the lone wolf. They're on the run. All of society is against them. They become the ultimate underdog. Add to that his natural charm, his good looks, the fact that he wasn't a vicious killer, that he seemed to actually have some of the attributes of a Robin Hood, and he did help people on occasion, that he was a good father. All of this, of course, makes him a hero.
I in no way want to glorify him or justify his deeds, because they can't be. There are too many people who made it through the Great Depression without having to rob banks. Charlie Floyd simply didn't want to work anymore and make an honest living, and he chose to go that path. But I submit there's a little bit of Charlie Floyd maybe in all of us. I submit that there's a thin line separating good from evil, a line that all of us, I know speaking for myself, that I've danced on. Charlie Floyd waltzed way over that line. And God help him, he just couldn't get back.